Let us lay him in a boat with his weapons, and the weapons of his vanquished foes, said Aragorn. We will send him to the falls of Rauros and give him to Anduin. The river of Gondor will take care at least that no evil creature dishonours his bones. For a while the three companions remained silent, gazing after him. Then Aragorn spoke. They will look for him from the White Tower, he said, but he will not return from mountain or from sea. Then slowly he began to sing. From the Gate of Kings the north wind rides, and past the roaring falls, and clear and cold about the tower its loud horn calls. What news from the north, O mighty wind, do you bring to me today? What news of Boromir the Bold, for he is long away? Beneath Arm Hen I heard his cry, there many foes he fought. His cloven shield, his broken sword, they to the water brought. His head so proud, his face so fair, his limbs they laid to rest. And Rauros, golden Rauros falls, bore him upon its breast. O Boromir, the tower of guard, shall ever northward gaze, to Rauros, golden Rauros falls, until the end of days. Our choice then, said Gimli, is either to take the remaining boat and follow Frodo, or else to follow the orcs on foot. There's little hope either way. We have already lost precious hours. Let me think, said Aragorn, and now may I make a right choice and change the evil fate of this unhappy day. He stood silent for a moment. I will follow the orcs, he said at last. I would have guided Frodo to Mordor and gone with him to the end. But if I seek him now in the wilderness, I must abandon the captives to torment and death. My heart speaks clearly at last. The fate of the bearer is in my hands no longer. The company has played its part. Yet we that remain cannot forsake our companions while we have strength left. Come, we will go now. Leave all that can be spared behind. We will press on by day and dark. Well, after them, said Gimli. Dwarves too can go swiftly, and they do not tire sooner than orcs. But it will be a long chase. They have a long start. Yes, said Aragorn, we shall all need the endurance of dwarves. But come, with hope or without hope, we will follow the trail of our enemies. And woe to them if we prove the swifter. We will make such a chase as shall be accounted a marvel among the three kindreds, elves, dwarves, and men. Forth the three hunters. Like a deer he sprang away. Through the trees he sped, on and on he led them, tireless and swift, now that his mind was at last made up. The woods about the lake they left behind. Long slopes they climbed, dark, hard-edged against the sky, already red with sunset. Dusk came. They passed away, grey shadows in a stony land. They had come to the feet of stony hills, and their pace was slower, for the trail was no longer easy to follow. Here the highlands of the Emyn Muil ran from north to south in two long tumbled ridges. The western side of each ridge was deep and difficult, but the eastward slopes were gentler, furrowed with many gullies and narrow ravines. The dale ran like a stony trough between the ridged hills, and a trickling stream flowed among the boulders at the bottom. A cliff frowned upon their right. To their left rose grey slopes, dim and shadowy in the late night. They went on for a mile or more northwards. A little further north they came to a fold in which a tiny stream, falling and winding, had cut a stony path down into the valley. In it some bushes grew, and there were patches of grass upon its sides. "At last," said Aragorn, "here are the tracks that we seek, up this water channel. This is the way that the orcs went after their debate." Swiftly now the pursuers turned and followed the new path. As if fresh from a night's rest, they sprang from stone to stone. At last they reached the crest of the grey hill, and a sudden breeze blew in their hair and stirred their cloaks, the chill wind of dawn. Before them in the west the world lay still, formless and grey, but even as they looked the shadows of night melted, the colours of the waking earth returned. Green flowed over the wide meads of Rohan. The white mists shimmered in the water vales, and far off to the left, 30 leagues or more, blue and purple stood the white mountains, rising into peaks of jet, tipped with glimmering snows, flushed with the rose of morning. The ridge upon which the companions stood went down steeply before their feet. Below it, 20 fathoms or more, there was a wide and rugged shelf which ended suddenly in the brink of a sheer cliff, the east wall of Rohan. So ended the Emyn Muil, and the green plains of the Rohirrim stretched away before them to the edge of sight. "I think that we no longer need any trail to tell us which way to go," said Gimli. "Let us find a path down to the fields as quick as may be." "I doubt if you will find a path quicker than the one that the orcs chose," said Aragorn. They followed their enemies now by the clear light of day. It seemed that the orcs had pressed on with all possible speed. Every now and again the pursuers found things that had been dropped or cast away. Food bags, the rinds and crusts of hard grey bread, a torn black cloak, a heavy iron-nailed shoe broken on the stones. At the bottom they came with a strange suddenness on the grass of Rohan. It swelled like a green sea up to the very foot of the Emyn Muil. The falling stream vanished into a deep growth of cresses and water plants, and they could hear it tinkling away in green tunnels, down long gentle slopes towards the fens of Entwash Vale far away. They went in single file, running like hounds on a strong scent, and an eager light was in their eyes. Nearly due west, the broad swathe of the marching orcs tramped its ugly slot. The sweet grass of Rohan had been bruised and blackened as they passed. All day the track of their enemies led straight on, going northwest without a break or turn. As once again the day wore to its end, they came to a long treeless slopes where the land rose, swelling up towards a line of low, humpbacked downs ahead. The orc trail grew fainter as it bent north towards them, for the ground became harder and the grass shorter. Far away to the left, the river Entwash wound, a silver thread in a green floor. Slowly the downs drew near. It was still an hour before noon when they reached them, green slopes rising to bare ridges that ran in a line straight towards the north. At their feet the ground was dry and the turf short, but a long strip of sunken land some 10 miles wide lay between them and the river, wandering deep in dim thickets of reed and rush. Just to the west of the southernmost slope there was a great ring where the turf had been torn and beaten by many trampling feet. From it the Orc trail ran out again, turning north along the dry skirts of the hills. Aragorn halted and examined the tracks closely. "They rested here a while," he said, "but even the outward trail is already old." Ahead and eastward they saw the windy uplands of the Wold of Rohan that they had already glimpsed many days ago from the great river. Northwestward stalked the dark forest of Fangorn. Still 10 leagues away stood its shadowy eaves, and its further slopes faded into the distant blue. Beyond there glimmered far away, as if floating on a grey cloud, the white head of tall Methedras, the last peak of the Misty Mountains. Out of the forest the Entwash flowed to meet them, its stream now swift and narrow, and its banks deep cloven. The Orc trail turned from the downs towards it. Following with his keen eyes the trail to the river, and then the river back towards the forest, Aragorn saw a shadow on the distant green, a dark, swift-moving blur. He cast himself upon the ground and listened again intently. But Legolas stood beside him, shading his bright elven eyes with his long slender hand, and he saw not a shadow nor a blur, but the small figures of horsemen, many horsemen, and the glint of morning on the tips of their spears was like the twinkle of minute stars beyond the edge of mortal sight. Far behind them a dark smoke rose in thin curling threads. There was a silence in the empty fields, and Gimli could hear the air moving in the grass. "Riders!" cried Aragorn, springing to his feet. "Many riders on swift steeds are coming towards us." The host had almost passed when suddenly Aragorn stood up and called in a loud voice, "What news from the north, riders of Rohan?" Aragorn threw back his cloak. The elven sheath glittered as he grasped it, and the bright blade of Anduril shone like a sudden flame as he swept it out. "Elendil!" he cried. "I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and am called Elessar the Elfstone, Dunedain, the heir of Isildur, Elendil's son of Gondor. Here is the sword that was broken and is forged again. Will you aid me or thwart me? Choose swiftly." Gimli and Legolas looked at their companion in amazement, for they had not seen him in this mood before. He seemed to have grown in stature, while Éomer had shrunk, and in his living face they caught a brief vision of the power and majesty of the kings of stone. Éomer stepped back, and a look of awe was in his face. He cast down his proud eyes. "These are indeed strange days," he muttered. "Dreams and legends spring to life out of the grass." Very swift were the horses of Rohan. When after a little Gimli looked back, the company of Éomer were already small and far away. Aragorn did not look back. He was watching the trail as they sped on their way, bending low with his head beside the neck of Hasufel. Before long they came to the borders of the Entwash, and there they met the other trail of which Eomer had spoken, coming down from the east out of the wold. At last, as the afternoon was waning, they came to the eaves of the forest, and in an open glade among the first trees they found the place of the great burning. The ashes were still hot and smoking. Beside it was a great pile of helms and mail, cloven shields and broken swords, bows and darts and other gear of war. Upon a stake in the middle was set a great goblin head. Upon its shattered helm the white badge could still be seen. Pippin lay in a dark and troubled dream. Hundreds of hideous orc faces grinned at him out of the shadows. Hundreds of hideous arms grasped at him from every side. Where was Merry? He woke. Cold air blew on his face. He was lying on his back. Evening was coming and the sky above was growing dim. He turned and found that the dream was little worse than the waking. His wrists, legs and ankles were tied with cords. Beside him Merry lay, white-faced, with a dirty rag bound across his brows. All about them sat or stood a great company of orcs. Ugluk shouted, and a number of other orcs of nearly his own size ran up. Then suddenly, without warning, Ugluk sprang forwards and with 2 swift strokes swept the heads off 2 of his opponents. Grishnak stepped aside and vanished into the shadows. The others gave way, and one stepped backwards and fell over Merry's prostrate form with a curse. The orcs were getting ready to march again, but some of the northerners were still unwilling, and the Isengarders slew 2 more before the rest were cowed. They were on the edge of a cliff that seemed to look out over a sea of pale mist. There was a sound of water falling nearby. The orc band began to descend a narrow ravine leading down into the misty plain below. Merry and Pippin, separated by a dozen orcs or more, climbed down with them. At the bottom they stepped onto grass and the hearts of the hobbits rose. "Now straight on," shouted Ugluk. "West and a little north. Follow Lugdush." A sudden thought leapt into Pippin's mind, and he acted on it at once. He swerved aside to the right and dived out of the reach of his clutching guard, head first into the mist. He landed sprawling on the grass. "Halt!" yelled Ugluk. There was a moment's turmoil and confusion. Pippin sprang up and ran, but the orcs were after him. Some suddenly loomed up right in front of him. "No hope of escape," thought Pippin, "but there is a hope that I have left some of my own marks unspoilt on the wet ground." He groped with his 2 tied hands at his throat and unclasped the brooch of his cloak. Just as long arms and hard claws seized him, he let it fall. "There I suppose it will lie until the end of time," he thought. "I don't know why I did it. If the others have escaped, they've probably all gone with Frodo." A whip thong curled around his legs and he stifled a cry. He sat up and looked about. Merry was not far away. They were by the banks of a swift, narrow river. Ahead, mountains loomed. A tall peak was catching the first rays of the sun. A dark smudge of forest lay on the lower slopes before them. In the afternoon, Ugluk's troop overtook the northerners. They were flagging in the rays of the bright sun, winter sun, shining in a pale, cool sky. Their heads were down and their tongues lolling out. "Maggots," jeered the Isengarders. "You're cooked. The Whiteskins will catch you and eat you. They're coming." A cry from Grishnak showed that this was not mere jest. Horsemen riding very swiftly had indeed been sighted, still far behind but gaining on the orcs, gaining on them like a tide over the flats on folk straying in a quicksand. The Isengarders began to run with a redoubled pace that astonished Pippin, a terrific spurt it seemed for the end of a race. Then he saw that the sun was sinking, falling behind the misty mountains. Shadows reached over the land. The soldiers of Mordor lifted their heads and also began to put on speed. The forest was dark and close. Already they had passed a few outlying trees. The land was beginning to slope upwards ever more steeply, but the orcs did not halt. Both Ugluk and Grishnak shouted, spurring them on to a last effort. There was the sound of galloping horses. The riders were drawing in their ring close behind the knoll, risking the orc arrows, so as to prevent any sortie, while a company rode off to deal with the newcomers. Suddenly, Merry and Pippin realised that without moving, they were now outside the circle. There was nothing between them and escape. The dark edge of the forest loomed up straight before them. Night seemed to have taken refuge under its great trees, creeping away from the coming dawn. "Lead on, Master Brandybuck," said Pippin, "or lead back. We have been warned against Fangorn, but one so knowing will not have forgotten that." "I have not," answered Merry, "but the forest seems better to me all the same than turning back into the middle of a battle." He led the way in under the huge branches of the trees. Old beyond guessing they seemed. Great trailing beards of lichen hung from them, blowing and swaying in the breeze.